Hey, Sean, thank you so much for joining us on the segment. It's a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, absolutely, Raghu. I appreciate you having me on.
I know that you've been in sort of the security industry for about 20 years now. Just sort of give us your journey to where you are today at AWS.
If we go back to sort of the early 2000s, I was just getting out of the Air Force,
Hmm.
where I was a survival instructor of all things, right? So teaching people
Hmm.
which bugs to eat and which bugs not to eat and that sort of thing. And I realized I wasn't going to probably be doing 20 years and retire in the military, and that I had to think about a career outside of that, and there
Hmm.
wasn't much of a demand, at least at that time, for folks with skills in survival. So I had to start thinking about alternatives. And for whatever reason, I also found myself as the resident expert in MS DOS in our fighter squadron that I reported to. And so I sort of put the two together and thought, well, if I get out, maybe I'll do something in tech. And so I ended up separating, getting out, and I'll sort of share or not give you all the gory details on this, but I moved into sort of tech procurement. I was a purchasing manager for a while, and then that sort of really got my whet my appetite for tech. So I moved into a
Hmm.
net admin job. I moved into a sysadmin job. Eventually, I got picked up by Cisco as a
Hmm.
solutions architect, or some folks
Hmm.
call it a systems engineer. So I did that for quite a while. While doing that, it's sort of, again, very early security days, relatively speaking.
Hmm.
Security was still pretty nascent. Got pulled into some really interesting customer projects, working on, if you can remember, Cisco Pixes and local
Yep,
directors,
yep,
and
yep.
yep, yep. So I was working on those, and then ta-da! Overnight, I found myself as a security subject matter expert. Right, as again, somehow that happens. So from there, I shifted from systems engineering into sales and go to market, which I got
Hmm.
endless amounts of crap from my SE peers, constantly asking me why I would do something like that. And it's funny, invariably my response would be, so you remember there was a bank robber back in the 1950s. It was a guy named Willie Sutton. And when they finally caught Willie Sutton, and they sat him down and they said, hey, why is it that you rob banks? And Willie replies, because that's where they keep the money. Right.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so that's usually my answer for why I shifted from being an SE into, into sales. And anyway, to wrap it up, long story short, about almost 4 years ago in April, I got the call from the AWS recruiter saying, "Hey, we're doing some new stuff here. Do you want to come lead our
Yeah.
go-to-market activities and security?" And so the rest is history.
Love the story, and I'm just sort of go back to something you see at the beginning. You became the resident MS DOS expert. That must be quite a niche sort of title to hold, particularly the early 2000s. I sort of have to wonder what you were still doing, poking around MS DOS in the early 2000s.
Yeah, well, it had a lot to do with Edlin, my Edlin skills, if you remember that.
Yeah, and it's sort of funny, like the story also about how you said your SE counterparts sort of when you moved over onto more the go to market side, sort of like what
Yeah.
you're doing, and almost and I feel and I kind of associate with that because when I moved from being a customer to being on the vendor side, it's the feedback I got from my colleagues. Are you going over to the dark side, right? So
Yeah.
and I said, well, it's the same reason, right?
Exactly.
So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I just want to go back to what you said about being that MS DOS resident expert, right? And so
Right.
from there to sort of where we are now today and your role in at sort of the world's largest sort of hyperscaler driving GTM for security, like what has been your observation about how that sort of that change in what we consume from a technology perspective, how we consume it, right? Like the trends that have shaped that and where we are today.
We've just seen, so much evolution, particularly in the security space, in terms of how we think about security, mental models, and we'll get into some of that, I think,
Hmm.
hopefully a little bit later around security that have just been absolutely turned completely upside down. And then, of course, the advent of hyperscaling and private cloud and public cloud has just been completely transformational in terms of allowing companies to be transformative in driving their business and how they think about their go-to-market strategies. But it's also at the same time created great opportunities for the ne'er-do-wells, right? Who would want to sort of take advantage of the tech sprawl and technologies like work from home and just sort of the ever expanding edge and footprint of the network.
I was just watching your intro video about sort of your role, right? And something that you mentioned is that kind of obviously what you do is that you're helping secure your customers' cloud migrations. And what you find is that customers are often very familiar with how they secure on-prem, but have lots of questions of how they secure in cloud, right? So can you explain sort of how you articulate the key sort of similarities and key differences and ensure that they're focused on the right things when they're securing cloud?
I would say that, again, the best thing about my job, or the best part of my job, is the fact that we do get to sort of help customers avoid what we call having a bad day in the cloud. And really everything, every program, every initiative, everything that we do, whether it's training and education or certification or helping customers understand best practices, introducing the technologies, either ours or partner technologies, really revolves around this idea of just helping customers not have a bad day. But to answer your question more specifically, one of the areas that we spend a lot of time with customers on almost invariably is this notion of a shared responsibility model. While sort of conceptually a lot of our customers sort of get it and understand the idea, right, that it's a partnership between the cloud service provider and the entity that's running on that platform, there's a lot of nuance to that model, and oftentimes a lot of that nuance is sort of lost with the customer. They don't know exactly where that line is, right? Where you've got this notion of security of the cloud, which is again the responsibility of the hyperscaler or the cloud security provider, which is to provide physical security, network security, platform security. Right,
yep.
But then it becomes the responsibility of the customer or the person running on the cloud to provide data security and application security.
Yep.
Right. But as you begin to break those down even a little bit further, right, that's where it starts to get a little bit murky for our customers, right, where we got to kind of come in and sort of explain where those lines are. And then if you sort of overlay that with managed services, it becomes yet even sort of more murky, right? And so we spend a lot of time, like I said, helping our customers with sort of understanding the nuance of that concept and familiarizing them again with all the best practices, controls, and those sorts of things that are available to them to make their environments a little bit more resilient.
I'm glad you sort of brought up the shared responsibility model, because in my sort of one of my previous roles as a cloud security engineering lead, I remember very sort of presenting that shared security responsibility model a number of times. And I was actually just looking at an ESG report of the state of security in 2022. And again, sort of to reflect what you just said, is that 4 out of 5 sort of organizations that they surveyed reported that they still found a confusion in this shared security model, right? And then you kind of alluded to sort of some of those, the nuances about they weren't clear, sort of particularly on those boundaries about where those responsibilities lied. Now, if I again think back that I know AWS, for example, have been talking about the shared responsibility model in your best practices for the best part of almost a decade now. Right. Sure. So why is there still a lack of clarity and a lack of understanding in customers?
Full understanding requires that the customer sort of fully shift, their mental model around sort of on-prem controls versus, sort of cloud-based controls. And we frequently get into these discussions with customers that sort of immediately go deep into the controls. And so what they want to try to understand or to better rationalize, right, is it's okay, well, this is the environment that I'm coming from, and I need to understand the environment that I'm going to. And they sort of immediately want to gravitate towards analogs, right, of their current on-prem security controls, and want to understand immediately, okay, well, what is the analog for the cloud? And is it like for like? And can I just simply lift and shift my firewall or my proxy or my endpoint or whatever it might be from a control standpoint, right? And so we sort of will get sometimes high centered on those discussions and sort of need to work that out, with the customers. And then, frankly, AWS, as other hyperscalers, offers their own native, security services. And that's a big part of, my team's job, is to help customers understand what those are and how to use them. And again, rationalize on-prem controls with now cloud native controls. And so again, it gets nuanced and it can get complex, but sort of the customer just needs to make that shift and sort of understand and rationalize the differences between those controls.
Cloud security is such a vast and continuously evolving subject in its own right? So kind of like, I think as you go back to what you said is essentially your reason for essentially your mission is to ensure your customers don't have a bad day, right? From your perspective, what role does zero trust have to play in cloud security? Is that something that you regularly discuss with your prospects and your customers?
Yes.
Thank God.
Yeah. That unambiguously, yes. It's in every conversation we have, and customers are really trying to understand, what to do about it, and it's a different thing. It's like it's different thing in different contexts, right? Which is why I think there's a lot of sort of still ongoing confusion because of the diversity of use cases, right?
Yep.
That it can be applied to, right? And vendors would like you to believe it's just sort of this turnkey off the shelf thing you can just buy, and then you can just buy zero trust and you're good. And that's not really the case, at least not yet.
Yep.
Right? You got to think deeply about the use cases. Is it a machine to machine? Is it a human to application? Is it a, transformative control IoT connected vehicle thing, which is completely off your network, right? It starts to get really esoteric. But those are the kinds of discussions we're having every day. And then how do you think about it from an on-prem, private cloud, public cloud standpoint? And, how do you bring that all together?
I liked what you said about really focusing on use cases, right? And saying, okay, this is the best way to deliver security for this use case, and then tying that back into sort of, let's say, a sort of an approach like zero trust. So and I guess it's a bit of a chicken and egg question, right? As sort of like with your customers, how does the question of zero trust come up, right? Is it like a customer saying, oh, well, hey, we want to adopt AWS, and by the way, the security must fall into a zero trust approach? Or is it more the case of you lead with the use case, and then you ultimately show them how to build security around it that follows a least privilege model that then obviously lines up to zero trust?
I think it's pretty safe to say that when we're having conversations like that with customers, which again is every day, we are very, very reluctant to put the actual technology or the feature or the control at the beginning of the conversation, right? Because like particularly with something as sort of nuanced as zero trust, you really have to have a much more sort of in-depth understanding of the problem that they're trying to solve, right? That's really the key thing. What is it, the problem that they're trying to solve, right? And what are the very specific use cases, right? And so once you understand and that's sort of the Amazon, sort of way of viewing things just generally, right, is to sort of work back from the customer and the customer problem and what they're trying to solve. So, these types of conversations are no different, right? And then once we sort of get through that and we understand the problems that they're trying to solve, then we're still not ready for a technology conversation, right? What we should be then thinking about is, okay, what are particularly in this environment, right? Sort of with the macroeconomic conditions, and customers are looking very closely at their spend, right? And so what existing technologies, whether on-prem networking technologies and cloud service provider technologies like VPCs and that sort of thing, are in place that can be then leveraged with a simple augmentation of sort of more granular, identity control capabilities, right? And that's where we start, right? And we don't want the customer to think about solving for 100% of the problem right out of the gate, because it's just too big, right? Let's shoot for 80%. And then let's make constant but steady incremental improvements, right, as we go. That's sort of how we think about it.
And I think that's a really great sort of an approach, right? And it's such a practical approach. And I feel that the more we hear that, and a lot of my other guests have echoed the same thing, is that the more we hope that sort of customers actually approach their adoption in that same way, rather than sort of to be massively transformative in the get-go, make those small steps. When I first started looking at AWS specifically, and I looked at sort of the identity access management approach that you would wrap around all your services, right? And sort of essentially everything was built, every service was almost built least privilege from the get-go, right? And I thought it's instilling real security best practice from the moment you adopt, right? So given that, and given all the best practice and etc. that you've published, right, that's available, why is it that we still see examples of like open world readable S3 buckets or world writable S3 buckets, right? Because it just feels that like customers are not leveraging the tools that they have at their disposal to do better.
I think philosophically, we're headed, AWS is headed down the right path, meaning this notion of least privilege, this notion of security by default, right, is a path that we're going to continue to go down, because whatever the reason, right, that customers sometimes don't adhere to the best practices or what have you, right? Like CSPs should be doing absolutely as much as they possibly can to make these capabilities more intrinsic, right? To make them secure by default. I mean, which doesn't obviate the need for a shared responsibility model. That's not what I'm saying. But we should be doing everything we possibly can to sort of reduce the tax that our customers have to pay on security, and sort of building these capabilities into the fabric of the architecture. And that's sort of how we think about it intrinsically. Will customers sometimes still make mistakes? Sure, right? But we should be able to help them with those mistakes by quickly identifying, the impact, and then help them quickly remediate and get back to the business that they want to do, right? Like again, we put too much undifferentiated just as an industry, I believe we put too much undifferentiated heavy lifting on the shoulders of the customer, right? To go off and try to sort of run their IT and secure their environment. And again, we as an industry ought to be doing more to take that undifferentiated heavy lifting off of their shoulders and just build a lot of these capabilities in by default.
Absolutely. That I think is a really interesting thing about making it easier for customers to adopt these capabilities, right? Rather than trying to necessarily be about differentiating. So how much of that responsibility do you think it's about on the cloud service providers to provide those capabilities natively so that customers can do as much as possible through that sort of, I'm going to say, that single sort of platform that they're interfacing with, versus how much of this is kind of on third-party vendors to develop value-add services? Like, where do you see the balance between that?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's one or the other, but because of the nature of this industry and just security more broadly, like it changes daily, right? It's just a constantly and very rapidly evolving community. So for for one either cloud service provider or one security vendor to sort of assert that they've got all of the answers, right, that the questions could have, I mean, it's a moment in time thing, right? Wait 10 minutes and the problem will be different or have evolved, right? So I guess what I'm saying is that while the CSP should own, a big part of helping the customer secure their environment with native tools and capabilities, I think, again, as an industry, because it's a moving target, we should all be working more together in a sort of in a collective, right? Like the cloud service provider is not going to be able to solve all the problems that, or address all the controls that a customer might need. And that's the case for us as well as others. We need partners, right, that can be able to come in and either to solve for, a problem that we just are not solving for, or maybe it's to come in and solve a problem better than we're solving for it. And we on my team are just as likely to recommend that a customer look at a third-party solution that they are as to look at a native AWS solution, right? Because the right answer is to solve the problem, right? It's not the right answer is not to solve the problem necessarily just with a tool that Amazon provides. It could well be with a tool that somebody else provides, but we have to solve the problem for the customer, right? While at the same time, again, we're working to build more intrinsic capabilities, right, internally and into the fabric of the platform.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that brings us nicely on to sort of another question, really, from a security perspective. How do you factor in sort of the ROI benefits of the security of cloud security, right? Is that a key part of the conversations that you have?
Yes, yeah, they are, and I think and I think they're becoming increasingly more top of mind. Again, sort of back to this the macroeconomic conditions that we see today. We're increasingly seeing customers ask us to help them rationalize their costs, and it's not just security costs; it's all of their costs, right? At least on our platform, and I'm sure other platforms are seeing the same thing. Sort of help us understand where we can optimize our spend. Do we have duplicate spend? Do we have redundant spend? And we're having the same sort of conversations when it comes to security, right? Customers are saying, hey, either I'm spending all of this money on sort of third party technologies, and I want to reduce that. AWS, can you help me? And again, that knife cuts both ways. Meaning, we also know that customers are looking to third parties and saying, "Hey, I think I'm spending a lot on my cloud service provider. Can you help me optimize those spends as well?" Right? And that's great. Like we want at the end of the day whatever's best for the customer. Both in terms of effectiveness and risk reduction and spend as well. So. Yeah, I mean, like I said, it sort of goes both ways, and again, we are increasingly seeing those customers and sort of asking about cost optimization and the sort of the derivative security cost optimization questions as well.
Yeah, I think, and absolutely right. Ultimately, what is best for the customer, and it's adopting security in a way that is also. That they're able to show sort of the returns on it, just in the same way they're able to show the returns on, let's say, migrating to cloud. So, kind of going back to that and going back to sort of your day job, right? Like when you have those conversations with customers and you're helping them migrate to cloud, what are the sort of the top 3 security challenges that they bring up versus, let's say, the ones that you communicate to them or the ones that you observe across your customers?
I think first and foremost is the idea now of the shared responsibility model. I mean, that's sort of right out of the gate, whether they're using our MAP program to help with their assistance or, whatever it is, right? The question of, just security and how do we think about security now in sort of this hybrid environment, right? On-prem and then cloud and then maybe even hybrid and multi-cloud, right? Like they want to understand how they should be thinking about it and where the responsibilities lie. That's sort of a conversation we have right out of the gate. Second, this notion of portability, control portability, right? And hey, I've made all these investments, in my sort of on-prem security environment and the controls. Like, how many of these can I bring with me? Right? Can I bring all of them? Can I bring some of them? Right? And so we have to sit down and sort of rationalize, how they do that and how many of the controls they can bring and just sort of there are cloud versions of, or right? And that's and that's a big one. And then finally, just sort of what's available to me to sort of visualize and understand, okay, now I've got all my assets or a lot of my assets in the cloud, my controls have been rationalized. Now, what do you have available to me that I can sort of monitor in an ongoing way and provide to either to my SOC team, or maybe they use they outsource to, third-party MSSP, to sort of let them know if something has gone from, green to red. Those are usually the three things that we hit right out of the gate.
And then what is in terms of the threats that the customers are concerned about, right? From sort of that point about when they're starting their migration to when they are at a level of maturity, what are the threats they're concerned about, and does the nature of those threats change as their cloud migration matures?
The conversations we have sort of span the entire gamut. I mean, just generally we're going to try to get the customer to think about risk and risk mitigation sort of as early in the migration process as we can. And even further, frankly, if we can get it back into sort of a DevSecOps conversation and to get them thinking about SDLC and, secure coding practices and those sorts of things, even that much, right? That much the better that we can get them thinking about that. And then, after that, we sort of follow very similar sort of framework concepts, NIST, right? We'll use NIST oftentimes, at varying stages of the cloud, migration journey. Make sure they've got proper, identification and identity, controls in place, and they're looking at access control. Do they have the ability to detect threats, protect against threats, respond to threats, recover from threats, right? All of the sort of the standard frameworks that customers are familiar with. Again, we work to help them understand, again, what the cloud analog of those things are, and again to try to, as best we can, unify those controls if they're in a hybrid environment. Many of our customers are sort of what we call cloud native, and they're just sort of born in the cloud. And so they're okay just using, sort of the traditional cloud services. But many customers, most customers, in fact, are still hybrid, right? And they have to rationalize at a minimum on-prem and AWS, but oftentimes on-prem sort of multiple cloud providers.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually that kind of brings me on to sort of a more forward-looking question, right? Like when you sort of look at your cloud crystal ball, right? What do you see as sort of potentially the evolving threats that are going to affect sort of consumers of cloud? And what do you think are sort of the key security capabilities that are going to develop to help mitigate against those?
That's an interesting question, and that's what makes me excited to get up and to do what I do every day, right? Is that, again, the idea of threats and the threat landscape is so nascent. This is not a static industry, it's this constant sort of cat and mouse game, this spy versus spy thing. And I mean, I guess my answer is probably not going to surprise anybody, particularly with, sort of the prevalence of ChatGPT these days, just sort of being everywhere, right? But the idea of these, of these AIs being built on these large language models, right, that are just becoming increasingly more, more and more sophisticated. And, we already see, publicly, we see anecdotal evidence of, of the bad guys, using these large language model driven AIs to, to build everything from malware to sort of social engineering scripts that are sort of more effective, right? And then I think as a necessity, you're going to begin to see the good guys begin to sort of also adopt, these sorts of technologies to sort of to mitigate, right, against, so it's like this sort of AI versus AI sort of world that's developing. And I don't know where this goes. I don't have a crystal ball or anything to know where this goes, but I think we're going to start to see, and I think that one of the stats I read, right, is that more than 80% of enterprises will be adopting sort of AI-driven security controls over the next 2 years, which I think says a lot, right, about how the industry is thinking about AI. So I think it's going to be a really interesting, future and a really exciting time for a variety of reasons, right? To be in this industry and on this side of the team, right? And helping protect our customers.
Absolutely, and I think just with the development of sort of more sophisticated machine learning and then more sort of general purpose AI that's being developed, right? Being experts in being able to communicate the real value of those to the customers is so important, because I think that the whole sort of AI ML, people just chuck that term in, right, and not truly understand what the differentiators are and how they should be leveraged. So being able to sort of express that, and particularly to secure their environments, I think is a fascinating place to be. I have one last question, right? So today we sort of, when we talk about security, we kind of equate that with sort of cyber resilience and resilience and being able to continue to function in the space of sort of adversity. So I want to go back to your to sort of your time in the armed forces as someone who's sort of coaching around sort of survival training, right? What are the best bugs to eat to ensure survival and resilience? And and what are the vegan and vegetarian options available for the vegans and vegetarians?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. The bug conversation is quite a bit longer than we probably have time for, but I will give you when I was doing that, we had land survival, water survival, Arctic survival, jungle survival. But if you do happen to find yourself, stranded somewhere in a dinghy, out in the middle of the ocean, and you're fishing for sustenance, right? What I can tell you is, do not eat the fish with beaks. Do not eat the fish with beaks. The fish with the beaks are eating some of the poisonous corals and different things, and will make you violently ill. So that's one tip I can give you relative to to your survival abilities.
That's fantastic. Well, Sean, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure having you on today's show. It's a wonderful conversation. And for listeners, if you want to learn more about how AWS and Illumio are enabling organizations to reduce risk and achieve resilience as they migrate to cloud, go and visit illumio.com and have a look at the AWS solutions on there. So, Sean, thank you again for your time today. Really appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks for having me, Raghu.